The Lost Castle by J.P. O'Brien. Trudging down the street on his way home from school, poor Elliot dragged a dejected hand against the wall beside him. He scrunched his eyes closed and tried to focus on the sensation of the bricks as they scratched at his fingertips. The feeling was mildly unpleasant, but anything was better than thinking about the conversation that awaited him. In his backpack, he was carrying the history test that had been returned to him that afternoon, and stamped in ominous red across the top of the page was yet another failing mark. Elliot's parents were academics, and almost impossibly brainy. So, after a succession of similarly poor results, they had promised Elliot's history teacher, Mr. Burnett, that they would personally step in to assist with his studies. But they didn't seem to appreciate the trouble their son had with all the names and dates and battles that, unfortunately, history seemed to be rife with. Despite their efforts, he just couldn't seem to get it. The boy continued feeling his way blindly along the wall, all the while trying to conceive of how best to deliver the bad news. With any luck, if he kept his eyes closed, he may get lost or accidentally stumble down a hole in the ground and not have to deal with it at all. But after another few steps, he was jolted from his daydreaming by an unexpected feeling under his fingers. He blinked his eyes open to find that he was touching a wall constructed not of bricks, but of enormous weathered stone slabs. He took a step backwards and looked up. He gasped. The boy found himself staring at the facade of what looked like a medieval castle. Its rugged but cracked walls were dotted with arrow slits, and at the very top sat numerous turrets looking out over the city. In the centre was the building's majestic entranceway, an arch made of colossal stone blocks around a wooden door that had been reinforced with criss-crossing iron bands and rivets. The whole thing looked like it belonged in a picture book of the forgotten Scottish Highlands, except that, for some reason, it was curiously sandwiched between the otherwise unremarkable townhouses on the street. What kind of nutter would live here? Elliot wondered, gaping up in astonishment. He drifted towards the grand entranceway and saw that hanging in the middle of the door was a tremendous cast iron knocker as big as his own head. Curiosity overcame him. He slipped his backpack off his shoulder, then stretched up to reach the metal ring. With both hands he heaved it up and then let go, allowing it to slam against its cradle. The sound it made seemed to silence the whole neighbourhood for a split second, before some unimpressed birds in a nearby tree returned to their chirping. Elliot listened for a response, but nothing came. He mumbled, feeling a little silly. He was reaching down to retrieve his backpack from the pavement when he suddenly experienced the eerie sensation that he was being watched. He peered over his shoulder at the building once again. Just above the entranceway, in one of the arrow slits, Elliot was sure he had seen the slightest hint of movement through the darkness. "Hello?" he called up. An old man's voice rang out from above him. "There is nothing for you here. Now go away!" The unexpected shrillness of the voice almost made the boy jump out of his shoes. "Who's up there?" he shouted back. "Look here!" called the voice, more impatiently than before. "My archers are all aimed at you, and on my command are ready to fire. Steady your bows, men!" Elliot's heart skipped a beat at the extraordinary threat. But when his eyes darted from one arrow slit to the next, he could see that they were empty. "You don't have archers?" "Well, no," came the sheepish reply. Elliot squinted up towards the arrow slit, concluding that the owner of this strange house must be some sort of lunatic. After a moment of stillness, he saw something shiny catching the light. "Hold on, are you wearing a crown?" the incredulous Elliot called up to the slit. "Of course I'm wearing a crown," snapped the voice. "You think a king ever takes off his crown?" Elliot snorted through his nose. "You're not a king," he shouted. "This isn't a real castle." The voice quickly became indignant.
Of course I'm a king, you insolent peasant. And I assure you this is a real castle. This is my castle. My family has been here for dozens upon dozens of generations. Far longer than your feeble family, I'll wager.
Elliot was taken aback by the barrage of insults raining down upon him from this rude stranger.
All right, whatever, you weirdo,
he muttered as he hoisted his backpack onto his shoulder. Then he turned to shout directly at the arrow slit.
Well, enjoy your magnificent castle, your highness. I'm sure you're very proud of it. Oh yes, exceptionally proud,
responded the voice, missing Elliot's sarcasm entirely. The boy rolled his eyes. He couldn't quite believe how deluded this eccentric was, playing make-believe in his so-called castle with its decaying walls and imaginary arches.
Not quite proud enough to share it with any real people, though, he jeered,
hoping to get the last word.
How dare you?
Rang out the disgruntled voice.
I assure you that it is more than grand enough to be shared. How dare you be so insolent?
Elliot shook his head to himself and began to walk away. But after a few steps, the voice called down once again.
Very well,
it said.
I shall allow you inside.
The boy paused and looked back. He was tempted by the invitation, perilous though it was coming from such a strange individual. Then he remembered the alternative, his parents confronting him as he walked in through his front door, asking how his test had gone. He felt his cheeks burn prickly red. He stepped back towards the grand arched entranceway.
You'll show me your castle?
He called up.
First you must lay down your weapons.
Elliot couldn't help but laugh. He was beginning to think that this old man was a few conkers short of an oak tree. The only thing he carried was his backpack, containing a couple of schoolbooks, a pencil case, and the burdensome history test. Inside the pencil case was a plastic ruler, which, he supposed, might leave a pretty nasty mark if employed that way, but it was hardly a weapon. He nonetheless took off the backpack and laid it on the pavement against the archway.
All right,
he called up to the arrow slit.
Have you lain down your weapons?
Came the cautious voice.
Yep. Then I shall let you inside.
Elliot stood gawking at the outlandish building until long after the sound of echoing footsteps had retreated inside. He ran his hands over the walls again. It definitely felt like a real castle. As much as he hated to admit it, the more he examined it, the more he started to believe there might be some validity to what this alleged king was saying. Just as he was beginning to think he had been forgotten about, the great wooden door creaked open a sliver. Elliot let out a surprised yelp. From behind the door once again came the distinctive voice.
Step inside, quickly, boy. I must not let down my defences for even a second too long.
Elliot obediently hurried through the gap into the dim interior of the building and heard the door slam closed behind him. All of a sudden, he could not see a thing. His heart started pounding in his chest, and he was beginning to wish he still had that plastic ruler with him. It took his eyes a few moments to adjust from the afternoon sunlight, but he eventually saw the form of the old man before him, hunched against the doorway. He was even more frail than Elliot had imagined, standing not even 5 feet tall, but dressed in extravagant, oversized robes that hung off his skeletal frame. Elliot guessed it must have taken all of this tiny man's might just to be able to open the door a few inches.
Welcome,
declared the old man, causing Elliot to jump.
I am King Leopold, heir to the wondrous Craiglochie of our castle. Everything you see before you is my kingdom.
Elliot glimpsed around. He wasn't sure what he had expected to see, but the inside of this place looked just as authentically castle-like as the outside. Then again, this wondrous castle appeared to him to be in a terrific state of disrepair. There were mouldy spots growing from the gaps in between the stones of the walls, and the uneven, cracked slabs on the floor were slick with a combination of moss and dust that must have accumulated over years of neglect. The air was thick and humid, and Elliot's palms had already grown clammy just from hanging by his sides.
"Well, what do you think, my boy?"
King Leopold asked, his voice dripping with pride. As he spoke, he repeatedly had to adjust the oversized crown atop his head. Elliot no longer had the heart to ridicule him.
It's very dark,"
he answered, trying to be diplomatic.
"Do you think we could perhaps turn on a light or something?" "Oh, blast!"
said the king, thumping a skinny fist against his leg.
"I left my oil lamp upstairs."
"Oil lamp? What about real lights? Do you not have electricity?"
"Electricity, pah!"
dismissed the old man.
"No use for any of that sorcery in my castle. Here things are done the right way."
Elliot was thinking how strange it was that someone in this day and age didn't have, or even appear to trust, electricity, when he was startled by a faint scurrying sound coming from the dark corner behind him. An involuntary shiver trickled down his spine.
"What was that?"
he blurted out.
"Oh, well, there may be one or two rats lurking around. Nothing to be scared of. Adds a bit of liveliness."
King Leopold let out an insane cackle and whacked an open hand against the nearest stone wall.
"How long has this place been here?"
Elliot asked, eyeing the floor uneasily.
"Centuries, my boy. Oh, what a life it has led."
The boy looked up, struggling to make sense of the king's answer.
"That's so weird. I've just never seen it. And I walk down this street all the time."
King Leopold boldly mistook his guest's bewildered expression for an eagerness to learn more. He led him down a cold, damp hallway and started introducing the series of cobweb-covered paintings of men in crowns that hung upon its wall. Each one seemed to have at least half an inch of settled dust on its frame, but King Leopold delighted in showing the paintings off anyway. He explained that they were his ancestors. There was a King Allred, and a King Bortrick, and a King Cadwallader. That was as many of them as Elliot caught before his attention faltered. In truth, he had only been half listening from the start. He was far more preoccupied with his footing, trying to make sure he didn't accidentally slip in a puddle or step on any rats. As the dreary list of names continued, Elliot tried to remain politely attentive, but with the complete absence of natural sunlight and the muggy air in the stony hallways, he soon felt his eyelids grow heavy. When he thought King Leopold wasn't looking, he turned and covered his mouth and let out an enormous gaping yawn. But the king overheard the sound of Elliot's disinterest and very quickly became indignant again.
"Excuse me, young man," he said angrily.
The crown slipped over his ears and he adjusted it on his head.
"I welcome you into my castle, despite my better judgment. The least you could do is try not to fall asleep as I am sharing my family's great history."
Elliot blushed.
"I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. It's just, I find it so hard to concentrate on this stuff. History. It's just so boring and confusing."
His eyes widened when he realized his error.
"Oh, sorry, you're from history."
King Leopold looked enraged.
"How dare you? I assure you I am from the here and now."
Elliot raised his hands apologetically, but he decided not to say anything. An uncomfortable silence filled the air, until eventually King Leopold spoke again.
"If you want to leave, I'll happily show you back to the door."
"No, look, I'm sorry, but it's true. I struggle when people expect me to keep track of all these names and dates. I'm no good at it. Even my parents tried to help, but I still failed the last test, and now I'm nervous about what they'll say when they see it. I don't want to get in trouble. I really tried." A sympathetic look came over the king's face.
"You don't want to upset your parents."
Elliot shook his head.
"I see,"
said King Leopold.
"You know, I feel responsible for defending the honor of all these kings.
He waved his arm up to the row of dusty paintings.
My family. They're not here anymore. The least I could do is keep their memory alive.
But he could see the boy was still thinking about his own problem.
Anyway,
said the king, trying to perk up.
Where is this accursed test?
It's outside in my backpack. You made me leave my weapons at the door.
Oh, yes. Well.
He straightened his back and thrust his chin out with dignity.
Now I can see that you are an upstanding young man. You clearly mean me and my castle no harm. So, if you promise not to try and invade me, you may bring your belongings inside. What is your name?
Elliot, said Elliot.
Well, don't just stand there. Go and get it, boy. Oh, I have a fun idea.
As instructed, Elliot made his way back through the musty hallway by himself and found the grand wooden door once again. With considerable effort, he was able to heave it ajar to find his backpack still sitting on the pavement, propped up against the castle wall. Then, having returned to the excitable king, he was guided up several spiral staircases to a rickety doorway that led out of one of the round turrets and on to the very top of the castle. A short distance in front of them were the square gaps of the battlement, where he saw 3 rusted cannons mounted on raised platforms, aiming out towards the city. Elliot moved cautiously towards the wall and peered over the edge. From their viewpoint, high above the neighbouring buildings, he could see for miles.
This is incredible,
he gushed.
I'm sure one of these still works,
muttered King Leopold to himself as he began emptying a sack of powder into the muzzle of a cannon, then tamping it down with a long stick. Elliot was still captivated by his surroundings, almost giddy with excitement.
Ha! I can see my house from here.
Without warning, the old king snatched the backpack off of the boy's shoulder and shoved it into the front of the primed cannon.
Wait,
Elliot said.
What are you doing?
His eyes widened as he watched the king light the fuse.
No, wait,
he screamed. But it was too late. The spark quickly trickled down into the top of the cannon's barrel, and Elliot had just enough time to cover his ears with his hands before the ensuing explosion. The poor birds on the tree below flocked away as the sound rang out through the unsuspecting neighbourhood. When the horrified Elliot uncovered his eyes again, he peeked out over the top of the wall. He expected to see unimaginable damage to the adjacent buildings, but the only thing he saw was several torn strips of fabric and countless tiny pieces of paper fizzling out of the muzzle of the cannon. A plume of black smoke rose up and drifted into the sky. Thankfully, the city around them remained unharmed.
Oh, blast!
exclaimed King Leopold with a frown.
Well, that's done it, hasn't it? I haven't had to fire one of these in a while, you know. I guess that's all 3 for the scrap heap.
Elliot stared in disbelief. His backpack and its contents now lay in thousands of disintegrated fragments on the ground. His frightened eyes met the eccentric king's before he at last gathered the wherewithal to speak.
That was awesome! Did you see that? You have cannons on your roof. Real-life working cannons. Well,
the king said, raising a hand to his chin.
Not working as much as I would like, but...
Elliot was too overcome by excitement to be bothered by the distinction. He couldn't stand still. He ran over to King Leopold, his mouth in a beaming smile.
Do you use these to defend your castle?
He asked. The king lowered his head and chuckled bashfully.
Well, not any more, I suppose. People tend to resort to other methods of diplomacy these days. Then again, there's nothing like a good old-fashioned cannonball if you really want to get your point across, I say.
Wow, exclaimed the starry-eyed schoolboy. The king looked back at him with a wry smile.
If you like that, I've got something truly special for you to see. Wait here.
Before Elliot could even answer, King Leopold scurried back into the turret while holding his ill-fitting crown in place, then disappeared down the narrow staircase. His guest stood gazing out over the city in awe. Minutes later, when the king returned, he was carrying a tattered scroll tied with a faded red ribbon. He held it out solemnly to his guest and introduced it.
This, young man, is one of my most treasured possessions, the Royal Charter of Craiglochievar Castle.
The boy paused. Though he was intrigued, he didn't dare take it. His eyes met the king's.
"You're going to let me touch it?"
he asked.
"Of course! I want you to feel real history with your own two hands."
Elliot slowly lifted his palms face up and watched the trusting king place the ancient scroll delicately into them.
"But it must be 1,000 years old,"
said the boy.
"Oh, at least! My family goes back dozens of generations. That's hundreds of years of royalty, all within these stone walls. Perhaps now you see why I am so deeply proud of this wonderful castle."
As carefully as he could, Elliot pulled the loose end of the ribbon between a thumb and forefinger, unfurled the brittle paper, then inspected the scroll. The writing within was far too elaborate and disintegrated for him to read, but King Leopold was more than happy to summarize.
"This ancient document has been here since the beginning. It certifies the kingdom's proud independence. It also explains that this castle is, and always will be, the cherished property of my family."
Elliot was lost for words. He had never imagined that something with so much meaning and importance could be so delicate. He looked up at the king again, who leaned in close in order to point out a marking on the bottom corner of the document.
"And you see this? This is the signature of the mighty King Allred. He is the one who started it all. You remember him from his painting downstairs."
Elliot felt ashamed that he could not remember. Trying to hide his discomfort from the king, he brought the royal charter up to his face and began inspecting the signature closely. Sure enough, he could very faintly make out the A of Allred, although the rest of the scrawled writing appeared to have been reduced to almost nothing by the passage of time. As he gazed at the page, he could easily imagine himself, centuries earlier, watching the king's ancient ancestor writing his name there. Extraordinarily, Elliot realized, that same piece of paper had now somehow found its way into his own humble hands.
"Actually,"
answered Elliot finally,
"would you show me his portrait again?"
By the time Elliot's thoughts returned to the world outside the castle, he had learned almost all there was to know about King Leopold and his family's long and eventful history, and he was almost bursting at the seams from the excitement. His eccentric host, who it turned out was quite the captivating storyteller, accompanied him back to the grand entranceway. But the smile quickly vanished from the schoolboy's face as he stepped out into the fading dusk light. His parents would want to know where on earth he had been for the last several hours. And then there would be the whole unpleasant confrontation about his failed test. To make things worse, he didn't even have any test to show them anymore. His whole backpack had been exploded into confetti. The boy spun around in the doorway, panicking.
"What should I do?" "Well,"
mused the old king,
"just tell them the truth, my boy. You went and saw real-life history for yourself. That's better than any test."
But Elliot wasn't entirely convinced that his parents or his history teacher would look at it quite as forgivingly. He felt like there was a 10-ton weight in the pit of his stomach. Seeing his concern, his host adopted a more conciliatory tone.
"Don't worry. Here's what you do. Take this with you. I'll wager they'll be so flabbergasted you've got it, they'll forget all about some silly test."
Before the boy could protest, King Leopold thrust his rolled-up royal charter into Elliot's hands and abruptly slammed the huge door shut. Elliot scrunched his eyes closed as the rush of wind hit him in the face. When he opened them, he found that he was once again standing in the afternoon sunlight. One hand was reaching out and resting against the coarse bricks on the wall beside him. He looked up. Craiglochievar Castle where he was certain he had spent the last several hours listening to King Leopold's stories, was nowhere to be seen. He blinked, then blinked again. There were no turrets or weathered stone walls extending high into the air, only the row of unremarkable townhouses stretching out in both directions, uninterrupted. The birds from the nearby tree continued their idle chatter. In a disorientated daze, Elliot started plodding slowly up the road. When he raised a finger to scratch the side of his profoundly confused head, he realized that slung from his shoulders were the straps of his backpack, in its entirety and unexploded. He ripped it off his back and searched through it for the test he would need to bring home. To his great relief, the test was there, flat between two of his textbooks. He breathed a grateful sigh. Then, in the bottom of the bag, Elliot found something else. The dusty scroll tied with the red ribbon. How in the... That evening, as expected, his parents asked about the test. Elliot had no choice but to own up to his poor mark, and their disappointment was just as painful as he had feared. Once they had finished expressing their dismay and emphatically reminding him how crucial it was to succeed in school, the boy assured them that he would improve. But this time, for the first time, he actually believed he could. Something had changed in him that afternoon. He didn't dare say out loud that he had hallucinated a guided tour of a magical disappearing castle, nor could he explain how its ancient royal charter had somehow materialized in his backpack. But the experience had planted a seed in him that would grow. In fact, almost overnight, Mr. Burnett began to notice a considerable shift in the boy's attitude towards his studies. Where before he had been, to put it gently, lacking in both patience and talent for the subject, it appeared that he had now developed a profound enthusiasm for it. The baffled teacher spotted him across the library study hall one day behind a mountain of history textbooks, and honestly wondered to himself if the student he knew had somehow been abducted and replaced. Unbeknownst to Mr. Burnett, Elliot was hunting for clues about Craiglochivar Castle and its lineage. With the ancient parchment by his side, he wanted to try and verify King Leopold's story. But to his great confusion, the search proved to be fruitless. He could find no recorded evidence that the castle, the king, or the family had ever existed. Nonetheless, there followed an unprecedented skyrocketing in Elliot's marks. When his next history test was returned to him, the result was not just passing, but outstanding. Mr. Burnett held him after class to ask him what had changed. "Well, it's almost like a puzzle," the student replied earnestly. "You need to connect all the different parts of the story together, and if you're lucky, you'll see the whole picture." Mr. Burnett was speechless. "I wasn't really trying before," Elliot continued, "because I didn't understand. Now I just get it." On his walk home from school for several days afterwards, Elliot tried retracing his steps to the street where he was sure this lost castle had once proudly stood, hoping, if nothing else, to be able to return the king's beloved royal charter. But he never saw the castle again. He was sad he hadn't had an opportunity to thank King Leopold for providing help where it was badly needed, of inspiring him to find the reason and the desire to keep memories of the past alive. But he kept the red-ribboned scroll on the shelf above his desk and would look up at it whenever he was feeling overwhelmed by his studies. It reminded him to stay curious.
You have been listening to JP O'Brien's Stories. For more, visit patreon.com/JP O'Brien Stories.